Most people believe the internet is a public park where anyone can shout. But physical architecture dictates movement, and digital architecture dictates belief. We assume free speech is a battle of ideas, but the modern arena isn't a town square. It's a privately owned colosseum, engineered for maximum cognitive friction. When a piece of misinformation spreads across feeds in London, New York, or Sydney, our instinct is to blame human malice or individual gullibility. Yet behavioral economics and platform telemetry reveal a different pattern. Outrage isn't a bug in the system. It is the primary liquidity that keeps attention economies solvent. The absolutist argument frames content moderation as the opening act of an Orwellian state. Every removal of a post is cast as a strike against individual liberty. Yet, historical precedent shows that societies collapse not when information is regulated, but when shared reality dissolves entirely. Consider the institutional history of public health broadcasts or financial disclosures. Gatekeeping was never exclusively about silencing dissent. It was an infrastructural filter designed to maintain systemic trust. When that infrastructure scales globally, the mechanics change, but the objective remains structural stability. If content moderation is framed purely as a culture war over free expression, we miss the hidden mechanism entirely. The real question isn't who gets to speak, but who owns the invisible rules governing what millions see before they even think to question it. But if these digital gatekeepers are private corporations rather than elected governments, whose stability are they actually protecting? And at what cost to the public mind? When Silicon Valley moderates content, everyone argues about political bias. But if you audit internal transparency reports from major platforms over the last decade, a shocking anomaly appears. Less than 2% of total content removals involve political speech. The vast, overwhelming majority, over 90%, are automated strikes against ad fraud rings, automated copyright bots, and financial spam. Political censorship isn't the core engine, it's the smokescreen. Why does this mismatch exist? Because platforms don't moderate to protect democracy. They moderate to protect programmatic advertising infrastructure. Look at the historical precedent of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, Section 230. Lawmakers didn't draft it to champion free expression. It was an emergency economic bailout designed to shield telecom giants from crippling civil lawsuits, traded in exchange for private policing compliance. This creates a mechanism most commentators completely miss. Content moderation is structurally identical to anti-money laundering compliance in global banking. Platforms are legally forced to act as private border guards for multinational brands. If a post threatens corporate advertiser safety, even if it is 100% true, it gets suppressed, not because it's false, but because it breaks the liquidity of ad revenue. When independent researchers trace how content gets flagged globally, they find that moderation pipelines are heavily outsourced to third-party contractors operating under strict non-disclosure agreements in developing nations, managed by algorithmic triage. Human oversight is virtually non-existent at scale. The arbiter of global truth isn't a philosopher or a judge. It's a desensitized content reviewer processing 3,000 flagged items a day under a strict quota. We're told that free speech is dying because of ideological tyranny, but the evidence points to a much colder, more systemic reality. Speech isn't being suppressed to control your mind. It is being filtered to maintain the balance sheet of digital landlords who treat human conversation like hazardous waste. But if global conversation is legally treated like a corporate liability to be managed, what happens when real, disruptive truths bypass the filter entirely?
When people imagine censorship, they picture a red stamp or a deletion notice. But real informational control in the 21st century rarely uses deletion. It uses friction. Behavioral data shows that when algorithms want to suppress an inconvenient perspective, they don't ban it. They simply alter its distribution velocity through invisible throttling. This is what sociologists call architectural silencing. By adjusting recommendation weights by fractional margins, platforms can starve an idea of engagement without triggering the user's awareness of censorship. You are free to speak, but the architecture ensures no one hears the echo. Consider the institutional history of broadcast licensing and radio spectrum management. Governments historically controlled frequencies not to dictate opinion, but to prevent signal collision. Today, private platforms manage the frequency of human thought, using proprietary relevance scores that operate entirely outside public accountability. When network engineers analyze these distribution algorithms, they find that content stability is favored over truth. Ideas that create high emotional friction, even when factually accurate, disrupt the predictable user retention loops required by programmatic advertisers. Therefore, systemic conformity is rewarded by default. The hidden mechanism isn't a shadowy cabal editing your timeline. It is an automated optimization loop designed to maximize user retention at the expense of intellectual diversity. The system doesn't hate dissent. It simply finds unpredictability unprofitable. But if the entire digital environment is systematically optimized to filter out unpredictability, what happens to human innovation when every thought must first pass an algorithmic profitability audit? When we discuss content moderation in Western democracies, we assume rules are written locally to protect free citizens. But looking at the back end of global tech deployment reveals a different reality. Moderation protocols are standardized across continents, turning Silicon Valley compliance algorithms into the de facto sovereign speech laws for billions of people worldwide. Consider the geopolitical friction when American corporate policy collides with foreign sovereign mandates. Platforms frequently face a delicate dilemma: comply with authoritarian censorship requests to protect foreign market access, or risk total economic exclusion. The noble rhetoric of global free speech quietly collapses the moment quarterly earnings in emerging markets are on the line. This creates an unexpected institutional paradox. Private tech corporations now wield more direct regulatory power over global communication than traditional nation-states ever did. Yet, unlike governments, these corporate gatekeepers have no constitutional checks, no public accountability hearings, and no electoral recall mechanisms. When legal scholars analyze cross-border information flows, they find that global censorship is rarely enacted through direct government coercion anymore. Instead, it is outsourced to private terms of service agreements. By weaponizing private contracts, states achieve state-level censorship without ever violating constitutional free speech protections. The hidden mechanism of modern information control is total privatization. When public discourse is governed by corporate utility agreements, freedom of expression ceases to be an unalienable human right. It becomes a conditional corporate privilege, subject to terms and conditions that change overnight. But if speech is no longer a fundamental right, but a least corporate privilege, what happens to democratic governance when the landlords decide the lease has expired?
We began this investigation by assuming that the battle over content moderation was a fierce culture war between absolute liberty and authoritarian control. But the evidence points to a much quieter, structural reality. The debate isn't about protecting your mind. It is about managing liability, defending programmatic ad revenue, and automating the risk out of human conversation. When we look past the daily outrage cycles and political talking points, we discover a sobering truth. Modern digital infrastructure does not exist to champion truth or suppress falsehood. It exists to maintain systemic predictability. Information that disrupts the corporate balance sheet is filtered out, not through ideological malice, but through algorithmic indifference.
This is why focusing exclusively on who gets banned or whose post gets removed misses the entire architecture of the system. The real power isn't held by the politician passing laws or the activist shouting in the town square. It is held by the automated economic pipelines that quietly determine what millions of people see before they even realize a choice was made for them.
If we continue to treat digital speech as a free-for-all playground governed by benevolent tech companies, we surrender our intellectual sovereignty to corporate landlords. True independence requires recognizing that information is no longer an open common. It is a privately enclosed utility designed to optimize behavior, not liberate thought.
The investigation ends here, but the real question is just beginning. If the rules governing what you are allowed to think are written to protect balance sheets rather than human truth, then what happens to human progress when the algorithms decide that original thought is simply too risky to distribute?